The flight attendant didn't lower her voice. She didn't have to. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the seat, right now." The words cut through the first-class cabin like a snapped crow. Conversations died mid-sentence. A fork froze halfway to a plate. The soft hum of the aircraft suddenly felt loud, intrusive, unforgiving. Ruth Carter looked up slowly. She had been reading the safety card, not because she needed it, but because old habits stayed. 61 years old. Decades of boardrooms, contracts, disasters averted in silence. Her hands rested calmly on the armrests of seat 2A leather, warm from her body. Paid for weeks ago, confirmed, twice upgraded with miles she rarely bothered to use. The attendant stood rigid in the aisle, early 40s, hair pulled tight, smile absent. This wasn't hospitality. This was execution. Behind her, a man leaned casually against the divider, one elbow planted like a flag. Mid-50s, expensive grey suit. The kind of confidence that came from never being asked to prove it. His carry-on already sat at Ruth's feet, angled inward, claiming territory, before permission was granted. Ruth noticed the detail immediately. He hadn't waited for her answer. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. Not loud, not defensive, just precise. The attendant inhaled. The practiced tone slid back into place. "There's been an internal adjustment. We'll need this seat." Need. Not request, not explanation. Ruth's eyes drifted to the boarding pass, still tucked in the seat pocket. 2A, her name. Printed clean. Undeniable. "This seat is assigned to me," she said. Her voice stayed even, the way it had learned to be long before anger stopped being useful. The man behind the attendant checked his watch. Gold. Heavy. He sighed, barely audible, as if time itself had been inconvenienced. "Let's not turn this into a thing," he said. Not to Ruth, to the attendant, to the air, to the universe that usually rearranged itself for him. The attendant nodded, once relieved to have authority reinforced. "Mr. Grant has priority clearance," she said. "We're exercising operational discretion." Operational discretion. Ruth felt the phrase land with weight. Not because it was new, because she had heard it before, dressed up in different suits delivered in different rooms. A phrase that meant rules existed but not for everyone. She glanced around the cabin. A couple across the aisle avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the window. An older man in the front row folded his newspaper with exaggerated care. No one spoke. No one asked a question. Silence, thick and practiced. Ruth exhaled through her nose. Slow. Controlled. Her mother's voice surfaced without invitation. "Pick your moment. Don't give them the show they expect." "All right," Ruth said. The word surprised the attendant. It surprised the man in grey even more. His eyebrows lifted slightly, not in gratitude but in confirmation. "Of course." Ruth stood. She moved deliberately, not rushed, not slow enough to be theatrical. She gathered her coat, smoothed the sleeve, slid her book into her bag. Small rituals of dignity. The man stepped back just enough to let her pass his cologne, sharp, expensive, intrusive. "Thank you for your cooperation," the attendant said, already signaling down the aisle. Ruth didn't answer. The walk through the cabin felt longer than it was. First class dissolved into business, then into premium economy. The lighting changed, the air shifted, the space tightened. Seat 5, C aisle. The attendant gestured as if presenting a solution. Ruth sat, buckled, hands folded in her lap. Only then did she feel it. Not humiliation. Something colder. Awareness. Across the aisle, a woman in her early 30s watched, her eyes uneasy. Laura Bennett, her name tag read. A junior attendant. Her fingers twisted nervously around a tablet. She opened her mouth, then closed it. A silent apology flickered and disappeared. A few rows back, a man tilted his phone, pretending to scroll the camera lens unmistakably angled forward. He didn't know who Ruth was. Not yet. He only knew something felt wrong. Ruth stared ahead. From here, the curtain to first class didn't fully close. She could see the edge of it sway as the man in grey settled into her seat. Champagne appeared. Crystal glass. He reclined, already comfortable, already certain the moment had passed. Ruth breathed in, then out. This was not new. It never was. The setting changed. The uniforms changed. The language softened. But the assumption stayed the same. That she would comply. That she would absorb it. That whatever this was, it would end here. Her phone vibrated once in her purse. She didn't reach for it. The aircraft door closed with a dull, mechanical thud. Finality. The kind that usually signaled surrender. Ruth allowed herself one small, private thought. They think this is over. She looked down at her hands. Steady. No tremor. 61 years of learning when to speak and when to wait had led her here to a narrow seat on a crowded plane, displaced without cause, watched by strangers who would forget her face by morning. The engines began their low growl, a sound Ruth knew well. Power building, systems waking. Her phone vibrated again. This time she felt it differently. Not urgency. Timing. Ruth Carter did not move. Not yet. The cabin lights dimmed by a fraction the way they always did before departure, subtle enough that most people barely noticed. Ruth noticed. She always did. The plane hummed with restrained motion, a living machine preparing to leave the ground. Overhead bins clicked shut. A baby cried somewhere behind her, then went quiet. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, the kind that lulled people into thinking everything was as it should be. Ruth stayed still. She did not reach for her phone. Not yet. She let the moment stretch, feeling the weight of the displacement settle fully before touching it. The seat pressed against her hip in a way that reminded her this was not where she belonged, not because of status, because of truth. Across the aisle, the man with the phone glanced at her again. He looked away too quickly, embarrassed at being caught. He was young, late 20s, maybe early 30s. Tech posture, hoodie under a blazer. Someone who had grown up believing systems were neutral until proven otherwise. Laura Bennett moved down the aisle, offering practiced smiles, her shoulders tight. When she reached Ruth's row, she slowed. The pause was barely perceptible, but Ruth felt it. Laura's eyes flicked to the curtain, then back to Ruth. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" Laura asked quietly. "Water is fine," Ruth said. Laura nodded, tapped something into her tablet, then hesitated. "I'm sorry about the confusion earlier." she added, lowering her voice just enough. That doesn't usually happen. Ruth met her gaze. Not with accusation, with recognition. It happens, she said. Laura swallowed. The words landed heavier than Ruth intended. She moved on without replying. The announcement came from the cockpit, calm and unremarkable. The captain's voice carried authority without warmth, routine without drama. Estimated flight time, weather conditions, safety reminders delivered for the 100th time. Ruth listened anyway. As the plane began to push back from the gate, her phone vibrated again. This time she reached into her purse, not hurried, not secretive. She unlocked the screen with her thumb. The message sat at the top, exactly where she expected it. Board review complete. Expansion terms ready. Legal standing by. It was from Daniel, her chief operations officer, not alarmed, not rushed. He didn't know where she was sitting. He didn't know what had just happened. He only knew the machine was ready. Ruth typed one sentence. Stand by. Initiate verification protocol on my authorization. No disruption to flight safety. Log everything. She read it once, then sent it. There was no drama in the act, no shaking hands, no rush of adrenaline. It felt the way turning a key felt. Familiar. Controlled. The plane began to taxi. In the operation center 3 time zones away. The first alert chimed. A low tone easily ignored at first. A technician glanced at the screen. Frowned, then leaned closer. Another alert followed. Yellow, not red. Advisory, not emergency. The kind that required attention, but didn't inspire panic. Yet. Within minutes, the message propagated outward, threading its way through scheduling systems, authorization layers, access gates. Nothing shut down. Nothing failed. But permissions tightened. Requests slowed. Automatic approvals paused, waiting for human confirmation. In a glass-walled office overlooking a darkened runway, a supervisor lifted his phone and dialed upstairs. Something's running a full verification sweep, he said. It's coming from the vendor layer. Which vendor came the reply? There was a pause. Fingers moved across a keyboard. A name appeared on the screen. Northbridge Systems. The supervisor frowned. That's not scheduled. By the time the plane reached the runway threshold, the first calls were being made. Quiet ones. Careful ones. The kind that asked questions without admitting concern. Back in first class, Thomas Grant reclined further into Ruth's seat, tapping the glass of his champagne with a satisfied exhale. He hadn't looked back. He didn't need to. The world had corrected itself in his favor, as it always seemed to. Veronica, the lead attendant, refreshed his drink without being asked. Her smile had returned thinner, now edged with relief. Crisis averted. Order restored. She did not notice Laura standing near the galley, staring at her tablet, the color draining from her face as messages began to stack. Ruth felt the engines surge. The plane paused, then accelerated, pressing her gently into the seat. The force was steady, powerful, inevitable. As the wheels lifted from the ground, she closed her eyes for a single breath. In that breath, she thought of a conference room 15 years earlier. Long table, dark suits. She had been the only woman, the only black executive. A man had spoken over her, rephrased her idea, taken credit without looking back. She had said nothing then either. Not in the room. She had waited, documented, built a case. 6 months later, he was gone. No scandal, no shouting, just absence. The plane leveled off. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she did not recognize. Area code East Coast. Corporate exchange. She did not answer. Across the aisle, the young man lowered his phone and leaned toward his seatmate. All the flights from this airline just flipped to delayed, he whispered. Nationwide. His seatmate frowned. That can't be right. I'm telling you, he said, scrolling. Every single one. Ruth stared ahead, her expression unchanged. The murmur began to ripple through the cabin, soft at first, then spreading like static. A question here, a glance there. Confusion without context. Veronica's voice came over the intercom moments later, slightly too controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised there may be a brief adjustment to our arrival schedule. We appreciate your patience. The words were smooth, but something underneath them had shifted. Laura looked down the aisle toward Ruth, her eyes searching, uncertain. When their gazes met, Ruth gave a small nod. Not reassurance, acknowledgement. In the cockpit, the captain glanced at a message that had not been there before. Operational systems undergoing verification. Maintain standard flight procedures. Dispatch will advise. He frowned, then turned to his first officer. Ever seen that? The first officer shook his head slowly. Not like this. Back on the ground, in a boardroom lit by screens and urgency, a man in his mid-60s stood at the head of the table, hands braced against polished wood. Richard Holloway read the report again, disbelief tightening his jaw. Who authorized this? He asked. A pause. Then carefully. The authorization traces back to Ruth Carter. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. Holloway straightened. Ruth Carter is on one of our planes tonight. Yes, the response came. Flight to Seattle. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Not in anger, in calculation. Above the clouds, Ruth Carter sat in seat 5C, hands folded, breath steady as the world beneath her began to slow. She did not smile. Not yet. The seatbelt sign chimed softly, a polite sound that did nothing to calm the restlessness spreading through the cabin. People shifted. Phones reappeared in hands that pretended not to check them too often. Whispers threaded between rows, low and uncertain, the way rumors always began before they grew teeth. Ruth felt it all without turning her head. Across the aisle, the young man in the hoodie refreshed his screen again, slower now, as if speed itself might make the information worse. His jaw tightened. He leaned back, then forward again, unable to sit still. Whatever he was seeing didn't fit neatly into his understanding of how things were supposed to work. Laura Bennett stood near the galley tablet, pressed to her chest. Eyes darting between messages and faces. Her shoulders rose and fell too quickly. She had stopped smiling entirely. When another attendant whispered something in her ear, Laura nodded once, then swallowed hard. Ruth watched none of this directly. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago how to read a room without announcing herself in it. Her phone vibrated again. Incoming call, corporate exchange, East Coast. She let it ring. In first class, Thomas Grant lifted his noise-cancelling headphones, slightly irritation creasing his forehead. He caught a fragment of conversation from the aisle, something about delays about system checks. He waved Veronica over with 2 fingers, a gesture that assumed compliance without request. "What's going on?" he asked. "We're already in the air." Veronica hesitated. "Just a fraction." "Nothing that affects this flight directly, sir," she said. "Operations is handling it." Grant didn't like the word operations. It was vague, imprecise. It suggested layers he didn't control. He leaned back, but the ease had left him. He glanced toward the curtain, then toward premium economy eyes, narrowing as if searching for the source of an itch he couldn't scratch. Ruth's phone buzzed again. Then again. Missed calls stacked silently. She slid the device back into her purse, closing it with deliberate care. The announcement light blinked on. Veronica's voice followed carefully neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as our dispatch team completes a routine systems review. We will provide updates as they become available." Routine. Another soft word. Another blanket pulled over something sharp. A man 2 rows ahead turned in his seat. "What kind of review delays an entire airline?" he muttered to no one in particular. No one answered. In a glass tower overlooking a runway, bathed in artificial light, Richard Holloway paced. He did not shout. He did not need to. The room already vibrated with urgency. Screens showed maps speckled with yellow indicators. Not failures. Holds. Pauses. "Confirm this again," he said, his voice low. "This is not a breach." "No, sir," the head of security replied. "All protocols are behaving as designed. This is an authorized verification mode." Authorized by whom? The answer came slower this time. By Northbridge. Executive level. Holloway stopped pacing. He looked at the name on the screen, as if it might change if he stared long enough. "Get me the flight," he said. Back on the plane, the captain received a message flagged higher than the rest. He read it twice. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He leaned toward his first officer. "Dispatch wants us to maintain standard procedures," he said. "But they also want a situation managed." The first officer raised an eyebrow. "On board?" "Yes." "Who?" The captain didn't answer immediately. He pressed the call button. Laura appeared moments later, moving faster now, her composure held together by training and fear in equal measure. The captain spoke quietly. Instructions precise. Names mentioned only once. Laura nodded, face pale. As she moved down the aisle toward premium economy, the cabin seemed to sense her destination. Heads turned subtly. Conversations paused. Ruth felt the shift before Laura stopped beside her seat. "Ms. Carter," Laura said softly. Her voice shook despite her effort. "The captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Ruth looked up. Calm, unhurried. "Of course," she said. "After we reach cruising altitude." Laura blinked, then nodded, relief and confusion colliding in her expression. "Yes, ma'am." "Ma'am." The word landed differently now. Laura stepped away. Her path watched by more eyes than she realized. The whispering grew bolder. Speculation found shape. People noticed the direction authority moved. Thomas Grant saw it too. He removed his headphones fully this time, watched Laura retreat, watched Ruth sit unmoving, hands folded, face unreadable. Something cold slid into his stomach. He leaned forward, craning his neck, trying to catch her reflection in the darkened window. He didn't recognize her. That was the problem. Important people were supposed to be recognizable. He flagged Veronica again. "Who is that woman?" he asked, nodding toward the curtain. Veronica hesitated longer this time. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other passengers, sir." Grant stared at her. Hard. The silence stretched. Then he scoffed and leaned back, crossing his arms. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. Ruth felt the plane settle into its steady rhythm. The hum smoothed, the climb complete. She reached for her purse and retrieved her phone, holding it loosely, now visible. The young man across the aisle noticed. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned toward his seatmate again. "I think she's the reason," he whispered. "The reason for what?" "All of it." Ruth stood. The movement drew attention immediately. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She stepped into the aisle as if she belonged there, as if the plane had been built with her passage in mind. Laura appeared at her side, guiding her toward the galley, offering privacy without explanation. The captain waited there, posture straight, expression, respectful eyes, measuring. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Thank you for coming," Captain Ruth replied. He gestured toward a quiet corner away from curious ears. "I've been advised there's a situation involving our ground operations. I was also informed you may be able to assist." Ruth met his gaze. "That depends on how you define assist." The captain nodded once. "Dispatch has requested we address a seating matter immediately." Ruth said nothing. "I understand. You were originally assigned to seat 2. He continued. "Yes. And that assignment was changed without your consent." "Yes." The captain inhaled slowly. "That should not have happened." Ruth's expression didn't change, but something in the air did. The acknowledgement mattered more than apology. "Ground operations would like to speak with you," he said, "as soon as possible." Ruth considered this. The hum of the engines filled the pause. "I'll speak with them," she said, "after my seat is restored." The captain didn't flinch. He nodded. "Understood." As he turned back toward the cockpit, the balance of the cabin shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Laura exhaled a breath she'd been holding too long. Ruth returned to her seat and sat. In first class, Thomas Grant felt the change without understanding it. He watched the curtain sway, watched the attendant whisper, watched his champagne remain untouched. For the first time that night, the certainty he carried felt thin. Above the clouds, Ruth Carter waited, her phone silent in her hand, as decisions made far below began to circle back toward her. The first crack appeared not in the cabin, but in the voice on the other end of the call. Richard Holloway did not raise his voice. He never had. That was not how men survived 4 decades at the top of American corporations. But the pause before he spoke was too long, and everyone in the operations room felt it. "She's refusing to speak until her seat is restored," the general counsel said carefully. Holloway looked at the screen again. Flight number, altitude, time since departure. The map pulsed with yellow across the country, like a restrained fever. Not panic. Yet, but close enough to taste. "Confirm something for me," Holloway said. "Was there any documented operational reason to move her?" The silence answered before anyone could. "No, sir," someone finally said. It was discretionary. Holloway exhaled through his nose. Slow, measured. Then reverse it. On the aircraft, the signal reached the cockpit as a priority message. The captain read it once, then stood. He did not hurry. Haste implied loss of control. In first class, Thomas Grant was mid-sentence when the shadow fell across his tray table. "Mr. Grant," the captain said. His voice was calm, but the cabin heard it anyway. Authority carried. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Grant blinked. He looked up, confused, then irritated. "Now." "Yes." Veronica appeared instantly, already tense, already aware something had gone wrong. Grant removed his headphones, the easy confidence gone replaced by the sharp defensiveness of someone who felt power slipping without explanation. "This better be important," he said, standing. "It is," the captain replied. They stepped into the aisle, heads turned. No one pretended not to watch anymore. This was no longer private. This was theater. "There's been a correction," the captain said quietly but clearly. "Ms. Carter will be returning to her assigned seat." Grant stared at him. "That's not possible." "It is." "I was cleared," Grant said, his voice rising. "I was told." "You were told incorrectly," the captain cut in. Not unkindly, but final. "You'll be relocating to business class." Grant laughed once. It sounded wrong. "You're moving me because she complained." The captain held his gaze. "No. We're correcting an error." Veronica shifted beside them, her face pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Whatever script she had relied on earlier was gone. Grant looked past the captain toward the curtain toward premium economy. His eyes found Ruth, still seated, still composed, watching without watching. "Who is she?" he demanded. The captain did not answer. He gestured instead. "Please gather your belongings." Grant didn't move. For a moment it looked like he might argue. Years of privilege pushed against the sudden resistance, searching for leverage that wasn't there. Then his phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced down. Red. The color drained from his face. "Excuse me," he muttered, stepping aside to answer. His voice dropped to a whisper, sharp and frantic. "What do you mean the systems are locked?" "That's not possible. I don't care who authorized it. Fix it." He listened, swallowed. His eyes flicked back to Ruth. He ended the call without a word. "Business class is fine," he said. Suddenly. Too fast, too agreeable. No need to make this bigger than it is. The captain nodded once. "Thank you." Grant gathered his things. No one helped him. As he passed Ruth, their eyes met for the first time. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply held his gaze steady and unyielding. He looked away first. The captain turned to Ruth. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone respectful. "Your seat is ready." Ruth stood. The cabin felt different now. Not louder, quieter. the kind of quiet that followed a verdict. She walked forward, her steps unhurried, each one reclaiming space that should never have been taken. As she sat back into seat 2A, the leather warm again beneath her hands, the plane seemed to breathe. "Would you like a moment of privacy?" the captain asked. "Yes," Ruth said. He nodded and returned to the cockpit. Veronica approached her posture stiff, her expression tight with something like fear. "Miss Carter," she said, voice thin. "May I offer you something to drink?" Ruth looked up at her. Really looked. Saw the calculation, the relief, the unspoken hope that this would be enough. "Water," Ruth said. "Please." Veronica nodded and retreated. Ruth reached for her phone. The missed calls filled the screen. Legal, operations, numbers she recognized, numbers she didn't. At the top, a message from Richard Holloway waited. "Ms. Carter, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you immediately." Ruth typed her response carefully. "I'm available now." The call connected on the first ring. Ruth Holloway said. He did not waste time. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me an explanation," Ruth replied. He paused. "You're right." He spoke then not defensively, but with the controlled urgency of a man who understood the stakes. He acknowledged the error. The lack of protocol, the assumption that had been made without verification. "This has exposed a vulnerability," he said, "not just in our systems, in our culture." Ruth listened. She did not interrupt. "I want the verification." Lifted. Holloway continued. "And I want to understand what it will take to ensure this never happens again." Ruth looked around the cabin, at the passengers who had watched her moved, at the attendants who had followed orders, at the man now seated elsewhere, staring at nothing. "This was never about my seat," she said. "It was about the ease with which it was taken." Holloway was silent. "I'll lift the verification," Ruth continued. "Gradually, in coordination with your team. But the contract extension will change." How he asked. Ruth's voice remained steady. "We will include oversight, independent review, transparency around discretionary decisions, data, accountability." "That will take board approval," Holloway said. "I'm aware," Ruth replied. "You have board members on this flight." Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes," Holloway said quietly. "I know." They ended the call without ceremony. Outside the cockpit, Laura Bennett watched the exchange from a distance. She saw the way Veronica moved differently now, the way passengers leaned back, reassessing the woman in seat 2A. Laura felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, recognition. In the operations center, the yellow indicators began to fade one by one, replaced by green. Systems resumed. Flights prepared for departure. The machine restarted, chastened but intact. Above it all, Ruth Carter sat in first-class glass of water, untouched eyes forward as the aircraft cut through the night. This wasn't the end. It was the moment the story changed hands. The cabin did not return to normal after Ruth took her seat. It tried. The motions were familiar enough. Carts rolled, curtains shifted. But something essential had changed, and everyone could feel it even if no one named it. Thomas Grant sat in business class now, rigid eyes fixed on the seat-back screen without seeing it. The headphones remained on his ears, but no sound came through. His phone rested face down on the tray table like an accusation. Every few seconds his fingers twitched, resisting the urge to flip it over and look again. Whatever message he had read earlier had not left him. It had settled somewhere deeper behind the ribs, where certainty used to live. Veronica moved through first class with exaggerated care. Her shoulders were tense, her smile overcorrected, too wide, too quick. When she set Ruth's glass of water on the tray, her hand shook just enough to notice. "Please let me know if there's anything else you need," she said. Ruth met her eyes. Not to intimidate, to acknowledge the truth between them. "Thank you," she said. "Nothing more." Veronica retreated, relief and dread braided together in her expression. Laura Bennett lingered near the galley, pretending to organize amenity kits that were already aligned. Her gaze drifted toward Ruth again and again, curiosity wrestling with something close to hope. She had seen people like Ruth before, important people, but never like this. Never quiet, never precise. Across the aisle, the young man with the hoodie finally lowered his phone. He leaned back, processing. She didn't yell, he murmured to his seatmate. She didn't even argue. His seatmate shrugged. "Those are the ones you should watch." Ruth heard none of it directly, or she heard all of it filtered through years of practice. Her attention was inward now, not retreating but aligning. The immediate crisis had passed. The systems were stabilizing. The next phase was already forming. Her phone vibrated once. This time she answered. "Ms. Carter, Richard Holloway said." His voice was steadier now, the initial shock replaced by calculation. "I want to be clear about something." "Please," Ruth replied. "What happened tonight was not sanctioned at the executive level," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "I wouldn't expect you to," Ruth said. He exhaled. "We have to manage the fallout. Media inquiries are coming in. Our customer relations team is already fielding questions." Ruth watched the cabin, the way people leaned subtly toward her, the way attention curved in her direction without permission. "That's your concern," she said calmly. "Mine is precedent." There was a pause. "What are you asking for?" Holloway said carefully, beyond what we discussed. Ruth considered the question. This was the part people misunderstood. They thought power looked like demands, like raised voices, like leverage applied brutally. But real change required something else. "I want to speak to your board," she said. Holloway did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to matter. "They won't appreciate being summoned mid-flight," he said at last. "I'm not summoning anyone," Ruth replied. "I'm making myself available." Another pause. Shorter this time. "There is a board member on board," Holloway said. "Eleanor Marsh." "I know," Ruth said. "How she's sitting 3 rows ahead of me," Ruth said. "She hasn't stopped watching since I stood up the first time." Holloway let out a quiet sound that might have been a laugh, might have been a sigh. "Of course she is." They ended the call without ceremony. Eleanor Marsh sat upright in her seat, spine straight, hands folded neatly atop a leather-bound notebook. 70 years old, white hair pulled back, eyes sharp as cut glass. She had not intervened earlier. Not because she hadn't noticed, because she had been listening. She turned slightly now, angling her body toward Ruth. Their eyes met across the narrow aisle. Eleanor gave a single nod. Not approval. Recognition. Ruth returned it. Dinner service began with an awkward hesitancy. Plates arrived. Wine was poured. The illusion of normalcy pressed itself back into place. But under it, something hummed. Thomas Grant pushed his tray away untouched. He stood abruptly, drawing a sharp look from a nearby passenger, then strode toward the galley. "I need to speak to the captain," he said, his voice tight. Laura stepped into his path without raising her voice. "I'm sorry, sir. The captain is unavailable." "You don't understand," Grant snapped. "This involves my career." Laura held his gaze. Her hands were steady now. "Then I suggest you return to your seat." Grant stared at her, incredulous. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The power he expected was not there. Not tonight. He turned and walked back his steps faster than before. In first class, Eleanor Marsh rose slowly, using the armrest for balance, more out of habit than need. She approached Ruth's seat with measured steps, her presence drawing immediate attention. "Miss Carter," Eleanor said softly. "May I sit?" Ruth inclined her head. "Of course." Eleanor lowered herself into the adjacent seat, smoothing her skirt. She studied Ruth with frank interest. "You handled that well," she said. Ruth did not respond immediately. Compliments were often preambles. "I handled it deliberately," she said instead. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's what I meant." They sat in silence for a moment, the plane steady around them. "You know," Eleanor said at last, "most people in your position would have made this personal." "It is personal," Ruth replied. "Just not only to me." Eleanor nodded. "That's what concerns the board." Ruth met her gaze. "Then the board should be concerned." Eleanor laughed quietly. "You're going to be difficult." "I'm going to be precise," Ruth said. Eleanor's smile widened. "Even better." They spoke then, not loudly, not long. About systems, about culture, about what happened when discretion went unexamined. Eleanor listened more than she spoke. When she stood to leave, she placed a hand briefly on Ruth's arm. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," she said. "In a different room." Ruth watched her go. As the lights dimmed further and the cabin settled into the long stretch of night, Ruth leaned back, eyes closing for the first time since boarding. The adrenaline had never surged. It had never needed to. What she felt now was something steadier. Momentum. Below them, the airline's network resumed its rhythm, chastened alert. Above it, a woman sat quietly, having shifted the balance without ever raising her voice. The plane flew on through the dark, carrying with it the weight of a decision that would not stay contained much longer. Sleep never really came to Ruth. It hovered close enough to feel never close enough to touch. The cabin had entered that suspended nighttime state where breathing slowed and lights softened, but her mind remained awake, tracking consequences that had not yet finished unfolding. Somewhere behind her, a man snored lightly. A tray table clicked shut. The aircraft held steady, cutting a clean line through the dark. Ruth opened her eyes and stared at the curve of the cabin ceiling, counting nothing. Waiting for nothing, letting time move on its own terms. Her phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't Holloway. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. She answered without speaking. "We're stable," he said, immediately, his voice low, careful. "Verification mode is almost fully lifted. No safety issues, no data loss. But the logs are thorough." That was the point, Ruth said. "There's something else," Daniel continued. "Internal chatter. Screenshots. Someone on the flight has been recording. It's starting to circulate." Ruth closed her eyes again. "How far?" "Contained for now," he said. "But it won't stay that way." "No," Ruth agreed. "It never does." Daniel hesitated. "Do you want us to issue a statement?" "Not yet," Ruth said. Silence is doing more work than words. When she ended the call, she felt it then. The moment when a private decision crossed into public consequence. The line was thin. It always was. Across the aisle, the young man with the hoodie was wide awake, screen glowing faintly against his face. He wasn't scrolling aimlessly anymore. He was typing, pausing, deleting, typing again. The shape of a story forming under his fingers. Ruth saw the reflection in the dark window. Not the words. The intent. Laura Bennett passed quietly through the aisle, checking seatbelts, checking faces. When she reached Ruth's row, she slowed. "Miss Carter," she whispered, barely more than breath. "The captain asked me to let you know ground operations has confirmed full restoration within the hour." "Thank you," Ruth said. Laura lingered. "There are questions among the crew." Ruth turned her head slightly. "And what are you telling them?" Laura swallowed. "That sometimes the system pauses because it needs to." Ruth studied her, saw the tension in her jaw, the careful choice of words. "That's a good answer," she said. Laura nodded, something like relief crossing her face, then moved on. In business class, Thomas Grant stared at the blank screen in front of him. He had stopped pretending to watch anything. His mind replayed the sequence again and again, searching for the moment he had misjudged. He had assumed. He always had. Assumed the rules bent toward him. Assumed resistance came with warning. His phone buzzed. Regional Ops Director. He didn't answer. He knew what the call would be. He could hear the voice, already measured, disappointed, not angry yet. Worse than anger. Reassessment. Grant leaned back and closed his eyes. The taste of champagne lingered sour now. Up front, Eleanor Marsh sat with a small lamp lit over her shoulder, reviewing notes in a narrow, precise hand. She underlined a sentence, paused, then added a margin comment. Not about systems, about people. She glanced toward Ruth once more, then returned to her writing. The announcement came quietly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are pleased to inform you that ground operations have confirmed system normalization across the network. Thank you for your patience." The cabin exhaled. Phones lit up again, messages refreshed. Relief rippled outward, mixed with lingering curiosity. Whatever had happened, it had mattered. Ruth felt the shift like a tide turning. The immediate pressure eased. The deeper current remained. Her phone buzzed again. A message this time. "Eleanor Marsh. When you're ready, I'd like to introduce you to someone." Ruth typed back. After landing? The flight continued westward, time stretching, then compressing as dawn approached somewhere beyond the horizon. The cabin brightened incrementally, light creeping in through windows that had been dark for hours. The young man across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate. "It's everywhere now," he whispered. "People are posting screenshots. They're connecting dots." His seatmate frowned. "About what?" "About who stopped the airline." Ruth heard this one clearly, not because it was loud, because it was true. She stood once more, stretching her legs, walking the aisle briefly. Not to be seen, to feel grounded. As she passed business class, Grant looked up instinctively, then away. The movement was automatic, almost reflexive. Ruth returned to her seat and sat. Laura passed again this time with a different posture, straighter, more certain. She set a fresh cup of coffee on Ruth's tray without being asked. "On the house," she said quietly. Ruth smiled. "Just barely." "Thank you." As the plane began its descent, Eleanor Marsh rose again, this time bringing her notebook with her. She stopped beside Ruth's seat. "I just got off the phone with Richard," Eleanor said. "He's assembling the executive team for tomorrow morning. Earlier than planned." Ruth nodded. "Good. He's nervous," Eleanor added. "He should be," Ruth replied. Eleanor smiled, unoffended. "You've given him something to think about." "I've given him something to see," Ruth said. "There's a difference." They stood together for a moment, the plane tilting gently as it turned toward the coast. Below them, lights clustered, then spread, the city coming into focus. "People will ask why you did it," Eleanor said. "They already are." "And what will you say?" Ruth looked out the window, watching the ground rise to meet them. "That sometimes the system needs to feel the weight of its own decisions." The wheels touched down with a solid thud reverberation, traveling through the cabin. Applause broke out in Pocket's habit more than celebration. As the plane slowed, phones buzzed in unison. Messages stacked, notifications multiplied. Ruth remained seated until the seatbelt sign went dark. When she stood, the aisle parted without instruction. Laura watched her go, a new steadiness in her eyes. Grant remained seated unmoving. Eleanor followed a step behind. At the door, the captain waited, posture formal, expression respectful. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Thank you." For what Ruth asked. For reminding us, he said carefully, that systems are only as good as the people they protect. Ruth inclined her head and stepped into the jet bridge. The air cooler, sharper, real. Behind her, the cabin buzzed with stories that would grow legs by morning. Ahead of her, the day waited. The story was no longer contained by altitude. The terminal smelled like coffee and floor cleaner, that particular pre-dawn mix that meant the night had worked overtime and the morning wasn't ready yet. Ruth stepped into it without breaking stride. Her heels clicked once, then settled into the softer rhythm of carpet. The jet bridge door closed behind her, sealing the aircraft and everything it had witnessed. A man in a dark coat stood just beyond the gate sign, phone pressed to his ear, posture rigid. He lowered it when he saw her eyes sharpening with recognition he hadn't earned yet. "Ms. Carter," he said, stepping forward too quickly. "I'm with corporate communications." Ruth stopped. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look pleased. Not now, she said. He hesitated. The story is moving faster than we expected. That's what stories do, Ruth replied. She moved again. He didn't follow. Outside the windows, the sky was turning the color of steel, dipped in milk. Early flights lined up like thoughts waiting to be spoken. Ruth walked past a coffee kiosk, just opening its shutters, past a janitor finishing his sweep, past a family asleep across 3 seats, the child's head resting on a jacket. Ordinary life. The kind that kept going while systems failed and recovered overhead. Her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. Press inquiries increasing. Internal memo drafted. Awaiting direction. She typed as she walked. Hold. No statements. Prepare facts only. Timeline clean. At the baggage carousel, Eleanor Marsh waited, coat draped over one arm, notebook tucked under the other. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stepped into Ruth's path at the precise moment she would have passed. Good morning, Eleanor said. Morning, Ruth replied. Eleanor fell into step beside her. You understand this won't stay contained to a meeting, she said. The board will want answers. So will regulators. They should, Ruth said. Eleanor glanced at her. You're not worried? I'm attentive, Ruth said. There's a difference. They exited into the chill breath, briefly visible. A car waited at the curb engine, idling driver, standing at attention without looking like it. Ruth paused before getting in. Eleanor, she said, I don't want this framed as a personal grievance. Eleanor nodded. I wouldn't insult you by suggesting it should be. Inside the car, the city slid past in fragments. Glass, concrete. A billboard half lit, promising certainty it couldn't deliver. Ruth leaned back, eyes open, mind already in the room she hadn't entered yet. At headquarters, the conference room lights were on early. Too early. That kind of light carried anxiety with it. Richard Holloway stood at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the posture of a man preparing to absorb impact. When Ruth entered the room, went quiet. Not respectful quiet. Calculating quiet. Ruth Holloway said, stepping forward. Thank you for coming. I was already coming, she replied. Chairs scraped softly as people adjusted. Legal counsel, operations, security. A few faces Ruth recognized from years of negotiation. A few new ones, younger, sharper, already cataloguing her. Holloway gestured to a seat. Before you begin, Ruth said, cutting in gently. I want the timeline entered into the record as it happened. A murmur rippled. Holloway nodded. Of course. Ruth spoke without notes. She described the removal, the language used, the lack of documentation, the assumption. She did not embellish. She did not accuse. She recited facts like coordinates. When she finished, silence. Hell. Ms. Carter. The General Counsel began. Are you alleging discrimination? I'm alleging discretion without accountability, Ruth said, which invites discrimination, whether intended or not. Holloway exhaled. The verification protocol was authorized, Ruth said. Contractually, logged, reversible, and necessary. A younger executive leaned forward. You froze $700 million in operations. I paused automated approvals, Ruth replied. Your planes flew. Your passengers were safe. Your vulnerability became visible. That's semantics, he said. That's architecture, Ruth replied. Eleanor watched hands folded, saying nothing. Holloway raised a hand. Let's be clear, he said. We're not here to argue legality. We're here to understand consequence. Ruth nodded. Then understand this. If it happened to me, it happens to others. Quietly, repeatedly, without leverage. A beat, then another. From the far end of the table, a voice spoke up. Thomas Grant. Heads turned. Grant stood in the doorway, tie-loosened eyes, rimmed red, posture defensive and brittle. I'd like to say something. Holloway stiffened. This isn't... It is, Grant said. He stepped in, stopping short of the table. Because this started with me. Ruth watched him without expression. I followed what I thought was protocol. Grant continued. I didn't create it. You exploited it, Ruth said. Grant flinched. I didn't know who you were. That was the point, Ruth said. The system didn't know either. Grant swallowed. I've been suspended, pending review. The room absorbed this without reaction. It wasn't the outcome Ruth wanted. It wasn't the one she opposed either. I'm not here for your punishment, Ruth said. I'm here for correction. Grant looked at her, something like disbelief crossing his face. Then something else. Relief, maybe. Or shame. Holloway cleared his throat. We'll commission an independent audit, he said. Passenger displacement. Discretionary upgrades. Demographic analysis. Published, Ruth added. Holloway nodded. Published and oversight. Eleanor said, finally speaking, with authority. The board member's voice carried weight. Heads nodded. Outside the room, phones buzzed. Alerts stacked. A producer somewhere pitched a segment. A headline took shape. Inside the work began slower and heavier than outrage, but real. When the meeting adjourned, Ruth stood alone for a moment, gathering nothing, because there was nothing to gather. Eleanor approached her again, eyes softer now. You've started something, Eleanor said. Ruth met her gaze. I continued something. As Ruth left the building, the press waited across the street. Cameras, angled questions preloaded. She walked past them without stopping, the city swallowing her up. Later, much later, when the day had worn itself thin, Ruth sat by a window with a cup of tea gone cold. She opened her phone and saw the messages she hadn't read. Support, criticism, gratitude, rage. She set it down. The system had felt its weight. Now it would decide what to do with it. And so would the world. The story did not wait for permission. It moved before dawn, finished lifting, before statements were drafted, before anyone agreed on language. By the time Ruth poured her first cup of coffee, the headline had already escaped its original shape. Black CEO, first class. Airline paused. One call. Different outlets used different words, but the pattern was the same. Power, displacement, consequence. Ruth read none of it directly. She felt it instead in the way her phone warmed on the table from messages arriving faster than it could cool, in the way her assistant's voice sounded tighter when she called, in the way silence began appearing between sentences during conversations that used to move easily. By mid-morning, the narrative had fractured into camps. Some praised her restraint, others accused her of overreach. A few insisted the entire thing was exaggerated, a misunderstanding inflated by social media. Ruth recognized every reaction. None of them surprised her. What surprised her was the email that arrived just after 10. It wasn't from press. It wasn't from regulators. It wasn't even from within the airline. It was from a woman named Marlene Hayes. The subject line was simple. Seat 12. B. Ruth opened it. I don't expect a reply. The message began. I just wanted you to know that 3 years ago I was moved from my seat on a flight from Denver to Atlanta. No explanation, no apology. I was told to be grateful they found me anything at all. I didn't complain. I didn't know how. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I watched what happened to you last night. I saw myself in it. Thank you for doing what I couldn't. Ruth sat back slowly. The room felt quieter after she finished reading, as if something unseen had settled. More messages followed. Different names, different routes. Similar stories, not identical, never identical, but connected by the same thin thread. A quiet dismissal, a rule that appeared without warning, a dignity tax paid without receipt. At the airline, the response machine whirred into motion. A holding statement was released, carefully worded, apologetic without admission, emphasizing review, commitment, listening. Stock dipped, then steadied. Analysts debated impact. Short-term volatility versus long-term trust. In a windowless room 2 floors below the executive offices, a team combed through data Ruth had requested. Upgrade logs, displacement records, timestamps, passenger demographics, stripped of names, reduced to patterns. The first charts were inconclusive. The second were not. Someone cleared their throat. We're going to need more time, a data analyst said quietly. Eleanor Marsh stood behind them, hands clasped behind her back, watching the screen. Take it, she said. But don't stop. In another part of the city, Thomas Grant sat alone in his apartment, tie still draped over the back of a chair he hadn't worn since the meeting. The television murmured in the background. His phone buzzed again. He didn't pick it up. He had already read enough. Comments, threads, a photo of him stepping off the plane, face flushed, jaw set. Someone had frozen the frame at exactly the wrong moment. He shut the television off and stared at the dark screen, his own reflection staring back. Smaller, somehow. At noon, Ruth stood in front of a room full of people who did not trust one another yet. Airline executives, board members, legal counsel, compliance officers, all seated around a table polished enough to reflect their unease. This is not about blame, Ruth said. It's about visibility. Someone shifted. Another scribbled a note. You have systems designed to optimize comfort, loyalty, efficiency, she continued. But discretion without measurement becomes bias. Not always malicious, often invisible, until it isn't. A compliance officer raised a hand. What you're proposing would require us to categorize passengers in ways that raise privacy concerns. Ruth nodded. Which is why independent oversight matters. Transparency isn't surveillance. It's accountability. Richard Holloway watched her from the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He had spent his career managing crises. This one was different. It refused to stay where he put it. Outside the building, a small group of reporters waited, not shouting. Waiting. They had learned something too. Ruth did not address them. That afternoon, the airline announced a temporary freeze on discretionary seat reassignments pending review. It was framed as a proactive measure. Industry insiders understood it as a pressure valve. Other airlines noticed. Emails crossed oceans. Calls were made behind closed doors. No one wanted to be next. No one wanted to be first to admit vulnerability either. By evening, a trade publication published a piece that changed the tone. Not a profile, not a critique, a case study. The language was dry, measured, hard to dismiss. It traced the sequence, the systems involved, the contractual architecture that made the pause possible. It did not praise Ruth. It did not condemn her. It explained. The comment section was quieter than usual. Ruth returned home late. She removed her coat and set it over a chair, the house welcoming her with stillness. She heated soup she did not taste, and sat at the kitchen table, the day finally catching up to her in small, insistent waves. Her phone buzzed again. Laura Bennett. Ruth hesitated, then answered. I hope this is okay. Laura said, her voice tentative but steady. I just wanted to say I've been thinking about last night. Yes, Ruth said gently. I've worked for this airline for 6 years, Laura continued. I've followed procedures I didn't question because I didn't know I could. Watching you, it changed something. Ruth closed her eyes. Change doesn't come from watching, she said. It comes from deciding. Laura exhaled. I decided to file an internal report, not about you, about patterns. Good, Ruth said. You won't be alone. After the call, Ruth sat in the dark for a long moment. The house creaked softly around her. Outside, a siren passed, distant and unconcerned. She thought of her mother again, of how she used to say that dignity wasn't loud, but it echoed, that if you stood long enough in one place, the world eventually had to acknowledge you were there. Somewhere across the country, a flight attendant finished a shift and opened her phone to read a message that made her sit down. Somewhere else, a passenger hesitated before accepting an upgrade, asking a question instead. Somewhere else, a policy draft gained an extra paragraph that would not have existed yesterday. Ruth did not know how far it would go. She did not pretend she controlled it. She only knew this. The system had not broken. It had spoken, and now it would have to listen. The first hearing was not televised. That alone made it more dangerous. Ruth sat at the long table with a glass of water she did not touch. The room sealed from cameras, the air scrubbed of drama. This was where power actually spoke, when it wasn't trying to be seen. The seal on the door clicked softly behind the last arrival, and the murmur of side conversations thinned into focus. Across from her sat men and women who had spent decades perfecting the art of measured concern. Regulators, advisors, former executives repurposed as consultants. They wore the calm expressions of people accustomed to controlling outcomes by controlling language. Ms. Carter, one of them, began a man with a careful smile and a resume that had outlived 3 administrations. We appreciate your cooperation. Ruth nodded once. Cooperation was a word that assumed leverage had already shifted. Sometimes it had. Sometimes it hadn't. "We want to understand," he continued, "whether what occurred constitutes a systemic risk or an isolated incident." Ruth leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively. Intentionally. "If it were isolated," she said, "we wouldn't be here." A woman to the man's left adjusted her glasses. "That's an assertion," she said. "Not evidence." Ruth reached into her folder and slid a thin stack of papers across the table. No charts, no color, just dates and codes and outcomes. "That's evidence," she said. Pages turned. Silence thickened. Someone cleared their throat. "These are internal logs," the woman said. "How did you obtain them?" "They're mine," Ruth replied. "Contractually." The man with the careful smile sat back. "You're asking for regulatory oversight of discretionary service decisions," he said. "That's unprecedented." Ruth held his gaze. So was seatbelt law. A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter. Recognition. Outside that room, the conversation was louder. By afternoon, the story had matured. No longer a viral clip or a trending phrase. It had acquired experts, panels, think pieces. People who had never been moved from a seat debated whether moving people from seats mattered. Ruth watched none of it. She spent the next hours in smaller rooms, repeating the same thing to different audiences, adjusting tone without adjusting truth. She spoke to airline leaders who worried about margins, to advocacy groups who worried about symbolism, to lawyers who worried about precedent. The message did not change. Discretion without accountability does not remain neutral. By evening, the pressure had shifted from her to the industry. Questions multiplied. Why now? Why her? Why not earlier? The answer, inconvenient and quiet, sat between the lines. Because now someone with leverage had been displaced, and leverage when displaced pushed back. At the airline, Richard Holloway sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. The city outside his window glittered indifferent. He replayed the moment on the plane again and again, not as it had happened, but as it would now be remembered. Not the removal. The response. His phone buzzed. A message from the board. Short. Direct. Proceed. He exhaled and stood, the decision settling into his spine. At the same time, in a smaller apartment across town, Thomas Grant packed a box, not hurried, methodical. He removed a framed certificate from the wall and set it carefully inside, face down. He had been offered options, transfers, quiet exits. None of them felt like choices. His phone buzzed again. A message from someone he hadn't expected. "Laura Bennett, I filed the report. Thank you for what you said." Grant stared at the screen. His thumbs hovered uncertain. He typed deleted typed again. "I didn't know. That's not an excuse. But it's the truth." He sent it, then sat on the edge of the couch, the room stripped of its former certainty. The next morning, the airline released the report. Not all of it. Enough. The language was careful but unmistakable. Patterns identified. Processes revised. An independent oversight committee established with authority that could not be waved away by loyalty status or internal titles. Ruth read it once, slowly, then closed the document. Her phone rang. Ruth Eleanor Marsh said, "They're voting this afternoon." "I know. You should be there." "I will be," Ruth said. But not to speak. Eleanor smiled on the other end of the line. That may be the most unsettling thing you could do. At the board meeting, the room felt heavier than usual. The vote passed without drama. Unanimous, if not enthusiastic. Public commitments were drafted. Implementation timelines assigned. Consultants hired. The machine adjusted, creaking but intact. Afterward, Eleanor approached Ruth, her expression thoughtful. "You realize this will follow you," she said. "Every contract, every negotiation." "Yes," Ruth replied. "That's the point." Outside, a small group of journalists waited again, fewer this time, more serious. Ruth stepped past them without stopping, the questions hanging unanswered in the air. Later, alone in her office, she finally opened the messages she had avoided all day. There were hundreds now, some angry, some grateful, some confused. One stood out. "My daughter saw what happened and asked why it mattered. I told her because sometimes rules pretend not to see people. Thank you for making them look." Ruth sat with that for a long time. In another city, another airline quietly revised a training manual. In another, a manager hesitated before using a discretionary override, checking a box he had never checked before. Change rarely announced itself. It leaked. As night fell, Ruth turned off her desk lamp and stood by the window watching the city settle. She thought of the plane of the seat of the moment, when she had chosen not to argue, but to wait. The world had called that restraint, or calculation, or power. She had called it memory. Tomorrow there would be another meeting, another question, another test of whether this would hold or fade. But tonight the system had shifted, and it would not return to its original position quietly. Morning arrived without ceremony. The city woke the way it always did, unaware that anything had shifted beneath its feet. Traffic flowed, screens flickered on. Coffee brewed in quiet kitchens. The system moved, adjusted, absorbed. Ruth stood by the window of her office as light climbed the buildings across the street. The glass reflected her face faintly, not as she looked to others, but as she felt to herself. Tired, yes. Grounded more than ever. The kind of fatigue that came after something had been carried to its proper place and set down. Her phone buzzed once. Daniel. Implementation schedule confirmed. Oversight committee seated. First audit date locked. She acknowledged the message with a single tap and set the phone aside. Down the hall, staff arrived in measured waves, voices low, movements purposeful. No one asked her how she felt. They sensed instinctively that this wasn't a moment for that kind of question. It was a moment for alignment. Across the country at the airline's headquarters, the new language was already being tested, not in press releases, in training rooms, in manuals, in quiet instructions given by managers who had learned finally that discretion without trace left a stain. Thomas Grant read the notice twice before folding it and placing it carefully in his jacket pocket. It outlined next steps. Counseling, review, options, no public shaming, no absolution either. He didn't feel punished. He felt changed. the kind that didn't fade with time. Laura Bennett stood in front of a small group of new hires, hands steady, voice clear. She didn't tell them a story. She showed them a chart. Patterns. Consequences. She explained why asking one extra question mattered. Why writing one extra note mattered. She watched their faces shift as understanding settled in. Eleanor Marsh sat at her dining table with a cup of tea gone cold, reading the final draft of the Oversight Charter. She smiled once briefly, then signed her name at the bottom. In 4 decades of governance, she had watched many crises burn themselves out. This one had hardened into something useful. Ruth left her office late that afternoon, walking past the press waiting outside without slowing. She had learned that attention was loudest when you didn't chase it. The city swallowed her again, as it always did, but something in the way she moved through it had changed. Not larger, clearer. At home, she cooked a simple meal and ate standing at the counter, the radio murmuring in the background. The anchor mentioned the airline briefly. No drama, no outrage, just an update. Oversight, new standards, industry response. Ruth turned it off. She sat at the small desk by the window and opened a notebook she had kept for years. Pages filled with fragments, margins crowded with ideas that had waited their turn. She wrote a single line, then closed it. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. A neighbor walked a dog. Someone laughed. Ordinary life pressed forward as it always did, carrying within it the aftershocks of moments no one had witnessed directly. Later that night, Ruth opened her phone one last time. The messages had slowed. The noise had thinned. What remained was quieter, more deliberate. She read one final note, then set the phone down for good. She did not feel victorious. She felt resolved. The seat had never been the point. The pause had never been the goal. What mattered was that something had been named, measured, and returned to the people it affected. The system had listened. Now it would have to remember. Ruth turned off the light and let the room go dark. The city still awake beyond the glass. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new negotiations, new attempts to soften what had been made sharp. She would meet them the same way she had met everything else, quietly, precisely, without apology. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like and subscribe and share your thoughts below, using 3 words only. Speak your truth.